You might think that ancient Greece was all about philosophy, democracy, marble statues, and the Olympic Games. But behind the gleaming facades of Athens and Sparta were sexual practices so disturbing they would shock even a modern audience accustomed to every form of human depravity. Before we continue, if you enjoy dark and forgotten stories, consider subscribing and commenting where you're watching from. This helps us immensely in producing more videos like this. Now back to the video. The ancient Greeks did not view sexuality as we do today. There was no concept of sexual orientation as we understand it. Instead, Greek society operated on a rigid hierarchy based entirely on sexual domination. Your role during intimate acts determined your social status, legal rights, and political power. Being the penetrative partner signified masculinity, authority, and citizenship. Being penetrated signified femininity, submission, and social death for adult men. This was not an abstract philosophical concept. This hierarchy shaped laws, determined careers, and literally decided who lived as a respected citizen or died as a social outcast. The sexual politics of ancient Greece created a system where power and pleasure became inseparably linked, leading to practices that would horrify any modern civilization. Let's start with the most normalized horror of Greek society. Pederasty was not an underground perversion. It was the cornerstone of elite education, celebrated in art, praised in literature, and protected by law. Adult men in their 30s systematically pursued sexual relationships with boys as young as 12, calling it mentorship in education. The practice followed specific social rules that make it even more disturbing. The older man, called the Erastes, would court a boy called the Eromenos through elaborate gifts and public displays. These were not secret relationships. Families often encouraged these arrangements, seeing them as pathways to social advancement for their sons. The boy's beauty and the man's status created a market of child exploitation disguised as cultural tradition. Archaeological evidence shows scenes of pederasty painted on ceramics carved into monuments and celebrated in public spaces. These were not hidden decorations. They were mainstream artistic themes displayed in homes, temples, and government buildings. The normalization was so complete that refusing these relationships could harm a boy's social prospects more than accepting them. The age parameters reveal the calculated nature of this system. Boys became available for these relationships at the onset of puberty, around 12 to 14 years old. The relationships were supposed to end when facial hair appeared, typically between 18 and 20 years old. But here's the truly disturbing part. The timing wasn't about protecting children. It was about maintaining the power dynamic. Once the boy developed masculine traits, continuing the relationship would threaten the older man's dominant status. The educational justification adds another layer of horror. These relationships were framed as mentorship programs, where older men taught younger boys about politics, philosophy, and social graces. But the sexual component was not incidental. It was considered essential to the educational process. The Greeks believed that physical intimacy created emotional bonds that enhanced learning and character development. Modern scholars debate the exact nature of these relationships, with some arguing they were primarily emotional rather than sexual. But contemporary Greek sources leave little doubt about their physical reality. Legal documents discuss regulations for these relationships. Medical texts describe physical practices. Literary works openly celebrate the sexual aspects. The evidence is overwhelming and disturbing. Spartan military culture took these practices to even more extreme levels. The Agage Sparta's legendary military training program began when boys were 7 years old. Taken from their families, these children entered a system where older warriors became their mentors, trainers, and sexual partners. The practice was so institutionalized that refusing participation could end a boy's military career before it even began. Spartan warriors were expected to form intense emotional and physical bonds with their apprentices. These relationships were seen as crucial for developing the fierce loyalty and courage that made Spartan armies legendary. But the psychological impact on children forced into sexual relationships with adult authority figures was never considered. The selection process was methodical and cruel. Older warriors chose their favorites based on physical beauty, athletic potential, and family connections. Boys who were not selected faced social ostracism and limited career prospects. Those who were chosen entered relationships they had no power to refuse, with men who controlled every aspect of their lives. The training itself combined physical brutality with sexual exploitation. Boys were deliberately underfed, poorly clothed, and subjected to harsh discipline. In this vulnerable state, They depended entirely on their older partners for protection, food, and emotional support. The system created perfect conditions for psychological manipulation and abuse. But pederasty was only one aspect of Greece's disturbing sexual hierarchy. Women faced their own systematic degradation through practices that reduced them to property and breeders. Marriage in ancient Greece had nothing to do with love or mutual consent. It was a business transaction where fathers sold daughters to husbands who could afford them. The age gap in marriages was staggering. Men typically married in their 30s, while girls were given away as young as 12 or 13 years old. These were not partnerships of equals. They were arrangements where adult men gained legal ownership of children. Wedding nights often involved what we would now recognize as statutory rape, celebrated as the consummation of a legitimate marriage. Greek law codified women's inferior status with brutal precision. A wife could not own property, conduct business, or make legal decisions. She existed entirely under her husband's authority with no recourse if he chose to abuse that power. Domestic violence was not just tolerated. It was considered a husband's right and responsibility to maintain household order. The isolation of women reached extreme levels in many Greek cities. Respectable women were confined to their homes, forbidden from participating in public life or social events. They could not attend theatrical performances, political assemblies, or religious festivals that included men. Their world was reduced to the domestic sphere, where they existed only to produce legitimate heirs and manage household affairs. But even within marriage, women faced additional humiliations that reveal the depth of Greek misogyny. Husbands routinely maintained relationships with male lovers, female slaves, and prostitutes. These affairs were not hidden or shameful. They were expected aspects of male behavior that wives were forced to accept without complaint. The sexual double standard was absolute and merciless. A wife's adultery was punishable by death or permanent exile. A husband's infidelity was considered normal masculine behavior. Women who showed jealousy or resentment were seen as irrational and potentially dangerous to social stability. The system trapped them in marriages where they had no rights, no voice, and no escape. Religious prostitution added another dimension of horror to women's experiences in ancient Greece. The Temple of Aphrodite in Corinth maintained over 1,000 sacred prostitutes donated by families as religious offerings. These women were not volunteers serving a divine calling. They were human sacrifices to economic and religious systems that commodified their bodies. The practice operated under religious sanction, making resistance not just difficult, but blasphemous. Families dedicated daughters to temple service, knowing they would spend their lives providing sexual services to male worshippers. The religious framing provided moral justification for what amounted to organized sexual slavery. The economics of sacred prostitution reveal its true nature. Temples generated enormous revenue from these services, funding construction projects and sustaining priestly hierarchies. The women saw none of this profit. They were valuable property generating income for institutions that owned them completely. Their bodies became religious commodities in a system that sanctified sexual exploitation. Archaeological evidence from temple sites shows the industrial scale of these operations quarters for hundreds of women, elaborate bathing facilities, and administrative buildings to manage the business. These were not small religious practices. They were massive economic enterprises built on systematic sexual abuse, disguised as divine service. The selection process for temple prostitutes followed familiar patterns of exploitation. Young girls were chosen for their physical beauty and family desperation. Poor families saw temple service as their daughter's only path to survival, while wealthy families used it to fulfill religious obligations without sacrificing their own comfort. The psychological manipulation extended beyond individual relationships to systematic cultural programming. These girls entered temple service believing they were chosen by the gods, blessed with a divine purpose. The religious indoctrination was so complete that many came to see their exploitation as a sacred duty, unable to recognize their victimization, even as it destroyed their lives. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Greek sexuality was the normalization of erotic magic designed to control and manipulate unwilling partners. The ancient Greeks practiced love spells with the same casual acceptance they showed for any other form of commerce. These were not harmless romantic gestures. They were calculated attempts to override consent through supernatural coercion. The magical practices revealed the depth of Greek attitudes toward sexual autonomy. Men regularly employed spells to compel specific women to desire them, seeing magical coercion as perfectly acceptable when physical force might be inconvenient. The spells themselves involved elaborate rituals, including burning effigies, reciting incantations, and burying cursed objects near the intended victim's home. Archaeological discoveries have unearthed thousands of cursed tablets containing explicit sexual demands. These were not abstract wishes for love or affection. They were detailed instructions to supernatural forces ordering specific sexual acts from named individuals. The tablets describe binding spells designed to drive women mad with desire, forcing them to abandon their families and seek out the spellcaster. The language used in these magical texts reveals the predatory mindset behind them. Women were not seen as autonomous beings capable of choice. They were targets to be conquered by any means that proved effective. The spells treat female sexuality as territory to be claimed rather than intimacy to be shared between consenting partners. Professional practitioners offered specialized services for different types of sexual coercion. Some focused on seducing reluctant partners. Others specialized in breaking existing relationships to create romantic opportunities. The most disturbing category involves spells designed to make women sexually insatiable, turning them into objects of pure desire, incapable of rational thought. The effectiveness of these practices mattered less than their widespread acceptance. Greek society tolerated magical sexual coercion because it reflected broader attitudes about male entitlement and female autonomy. If a woman could be compelled by physical force, economic pressure, or social manipulation, magical coercion seemed equally legitimate. Even more horrifying were the documented practices of zoophilia that appeared in Greek literature and historical accounts. While often attributed to other cultures, the frequency of references and mythological themes suggests these practices were familiar concepts in Greek society. Their literature does not condemn such acts as perverse, instead treating them as exotic curiosities or divine mysteries. The mythological framing provided justification for behaviors that violated all natural boundaries. Stories of gods transforming into animals to seduce mortals were not mere entertainment. They were cultural models that normalized bestial practices by giving them divine precedent. Zeus transforming into a bull to rape Europa was not a cautionary tale. It was a celebrated myth performed in theaters and depicted in art. The medical and philosophical writings of the period discuss these practices with a clinical detachment that is more disturbing than outright condemnation. Greek physicians wrote about treating injuries resulting from animal contact. Philosophers debated whether such acts violated natural law or represented alternative expressions of human desire. The casual academic approach reveals a society where nothing was considered too extreme to discuss or practice. Even the concept of consent, limited as it was in Greek society, vanished entirely when it came to enslaved people and foreigners. These populations existed entirely outside legal protection available for any form of sexual exploitation their owners desired. The systematic abuse of enslaved people reached levels that make plantation slavery seem restrained by comparison. Greek households routinely kept slaves specifically for sexual purposes. These were not individuals who happened to be attractive. They were human beings purchased and bred for their sexual utility. Children born from these arrangements became household property, continuing the cycle of exploitation into the next generation. The legal framework supporting this system was comprehensive and merciless. Enslaved people had no right to refuse their owners' sexual demands or those of anyone their owners designated. Resistance was punished with torture or death. Even testimony about sexual abuse was inadmissible in court because enslaved people could not legally accuse citizens of wrongdoing. The scale of this exploitation becomes clear when examining the household inventories of wealthy Greek families. Hundreds of slaves categorized by their intended use, including explicit sexual purposes. These were not hidden records. They were official documents filed with local authorities for tax and insurance purposes. The system operated openly because it was perfectly legal and socially acceptable. As we reach the end of this journey through the sexual horrors of ancient Greece, the pattern becomes unmistakably clear. Every practice we've examined operated on the same fundamental principle that might makes right. Whether targeting children, women slaves, or even animals, Greek sexual culture was built on the systematic exploitation of the powerless by the powerful. The philosophical justifications they created for these practices reveal the true genius of systematic oppression. By calling child abuse, education, sexual slavery, religion, and magical coercion, romance, they transformed horrific crimes into cultural virtues. Victims could not resist what society celebrated as beneficial to them. This was not a civilization grappling with moral questions about sexuality. It was a society that had answered those questions by deciding the strong had unlimited rights over the weak. The democracy that gave political voice to male citizens operated alongside systems that silenced everyone else through sexual subjugation. The legacy of these practices echoes through history in ways most people never acknowledge. The philosophical frameworks that justified Greek sexual exploitation influenced Roman law, Christian theology, and Western legal traditions. The same arguments used to defend pederasty and sexual slavery appear in modified forms across subsequent civilizations. Understanding this history matters because it reveals how easily sophisticated societies can normalize horrific practices through cultural conditioning and institutional support. The ancient Greeks were not primitive barbarians acting on savage impulses. They were educated philosophical people who created systematic justifications for behaviors they knew caused suffering. Perhaps most disturbing of all, they managed to present their civilization as the cradle of reason, democracy, and human dignity. For thousands of years, scholars studied Greek philosophy while ignoring Greek sexual practices, preserving the myths while bearing the reality. The marble statues and democratic ideals survived. The voices of the victims were silenced. The next time you see ancient Greece portrayed as a golden age of human achievement, remember the children forced into sexual relationships with their teachers, the women treated as breeding stock, the slaves who existed only for their owner's pleasure, and the magical practices designed to override human consent. Behind every marble column was a system built on sexual exploitation, so pervasive it makes modern atrocities seem limited by comparison. This is the true legacy of ancient Greece that history lessons conveniently forget to mention.